Welcome to the Indian Newslink podcast.
Good afternoon, Indian Newslink viewers and readers. We today have our dear friend Michael Wood, former minister. We are sitting at his office in Penrose, or Ellerslie as they call it. Good afternoon, Michael. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. And we thought we would ask you for your opinion. Budget is coming up in about exactly a week's time from today. Some announcements have been made. And what do you think will be the impact of the budget on cost of living crisis and issues that affect common New Zealanders?
Well, the former US President Bill Clinton had an old saying, and his saying was, "It's the economy, stupid."
Yep.
In other words, the most important issues for people and households come back to the economy. How well is it doing? Are people getting a fair share of our economic performance? And that's a real challenge for New Zealand this year. We're in a recession. We are seeing unemployment increase quite dramatically, and the government's actions are making the recession longer and deeper than it needs to be. All of the cuts that they're making aren't just affecting public service workers, they're effectively taking demand and money out of the economy. And during a recession, you actually need a government to support the economy and support jobs, and we're seeing the opposite. So my fear at this budget is that we see reckless tax cuts that will increase the deficit, that will result in cuts to health, education, housing and other areas that are important. And we will see a budget that makes the economy worse this year and makes life harder for New Zealanders. I hope I'm surprised, but that's what all the signs are.
But Michael, there are two things that come out of your comment just now. One is the National Party is saying that they have inherited all the problems of left by you as the previous government. And secondly, they say that tax cuts are important because people deserve relief, whereas your party, they say, believes in imposing more and more taxes. Is that the right approach? Is that the right thing to say?
Well, I don't agree with that. This is a government that's got a majority in Parliament, and their job is to lead the country and make decisions. You can't keep going back and saying, well, the other guys did this some time ago. They're the ones who are in control now. They're the ones who are making decisions about what happens in New Zealand. In respect of tax cuts, the problem for the government is they're trying to have it all different ways. On one hand, they're critical about Labour and saying that we created deficits. On the other hand, they're planning to implement tax cuts that will require $15 billion of borrowing.
Right.
You even have conservative commentators and economists who are now saying this is reckless and it's irresponsible. So we're seeing big tax cuts, and often for those people who have the most, at the same time as ordinary households are really struggling with the cost of living, and the government is cutting support, cutting cheaper public transport, cutting cheaper prescriptions and other supports for low and middle income households, while, for example, big landlords get very significant tax cuts. So their priorities are all wrong, and it's actually resulting in more debt, which is one of the things that they supposedly criticised the last government for.
Do you think the current government is going to borrow more than what the Labour government did? And how would you say that New Zealanders would get a relief if Labour were to come back? Because you've started making some headway in opinion polls in recent weeks. So what would be your solution to the current problems that the economy faces?
Well, let's start off by saying that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with any government borrowing at the right time and in the right way.
Right.
In fact, it's responsible for governments to borrow prudently, to plan for long-term investment in infrastructure, those sorts of things. That's the only way you can actually support some of those long-term investments. And also during difficult economic times, governments of all stripes in all countries will borrow to keep things moving. That's okay. It's a question of whether you're borrowing prudently and for the right things. The direct answer to your question, will this government borrow more than Labour would have, is yes. they are very specifically going to have to borrow, if they follow through on their promises,
Right.
an additional $15 billion to fund the tax cuts that they said that they would deliver. $15 billion. That is a huge additional load, and it won't actually deliver much support to low and middle income households. It'll mainly benefit those who have the most already. Labor would refocus to make sure we have an economy that's supporting jobs for people, that's supporting better wages, and that we are providing relief to ordinary families. They're the ones who are finding it difficult at the moment. We don't need to give tax cuts to the mega landlords, which is what National's doing.
This is one of the accusations levelled against Labor, that you keep on increasing minimum wages, which employers say they can't afford because they do not have the income enough to support, because you also believe in increased taxation. They say that you're trying to strangulate them from both sides. One side you increase wages, and the other side you increase taxation.
I don't quite agree with that analysis. And of course, what Labor did, if you look at our last term, was to ensure that the minimum wage kept pace with the cost of living.
Yep.
Didn't actually go beyond that. So we kept minimum wage up with cost of living. If you don't do that, then actually that means that the lowest paid people actually go backwards. Okay, if you don't keep pace with inflation, they actually go backwards. So we think that's a pretty reasonable and moderate thing to be doing. And the other important aspect is this: when low and middle income households have a decent wage,
Yep.
What do they do with that wage? They go and spend it in local businesses and in their local community. And that is why actually the international evidence shows that you tend to have a better performing economy and lower unemployment when people have a decent minimum wage. What we're seeing with this government, who are making this recession longer and deeper, is that households are closing their wallets. And that's actually going to do much more harm to a local business than a moderate increase in the minimum wage.
I suppose there can be arguments and counter-arguments on that. And let me now turn to two of the most important portfolios that you held, three of them rather, until the National Party came and took over. One was infrastructure, that was transport and various projects that you initiated. How is it different from the time that you were the Minister for Transport and Infrastructure?
We've seen a very significant change, and it's a change which I don't think is going to be helpful to actually solve the problems that we have in transport. What are the problems we have? Well, in our bigger cities, we have chronic congestion. It's very frustrating for people to have to sit in their cars in traffic jams. It's a major impediment to economic productivity. And because so many people are dependent on their cars, we have a lot of carbon pollution from our transport system. The steps that we were taking, particularly in our bigger cities, was about giving people more choices, primarily through investment in better public transport. And that means that people have got more choices. If you go to the best, most efficient, functional cities around the world, you can get most of the places you need to go to with high quality public transport. That was the kind of investment we were making. Things like the Eastern Busway, light rail, the CRL, light rail for Wellington, those sorts of projects. And they're long-term projects. They take a while, but they make life better and improve those things. What we have with National is a complete reversion. They have cut the funding for most of those things, and they're investing now in a relatively small number of very big, very expensive regional roads that actually won't fix most of those problems. So I think we've seen a real backwards move in transport policy, and it's going to make those problems that we experience in transport much worse, particularly in our larger cities. So I'm really concerned about that. If you look at things like the Auckland Council's long-term plan that they've just announced, the council wants more investment in public transport.
Right.
The government's transport budget actually cuts public transport investment by $1.5 billion. So they're not listening to Auckland, they're not listening to local communities.
So which means if you come to power in 2026, would you go back to your plans? And what I'm trying to ask or say is that how long will people, let's say Aucklanders, in the case of Auckland transportation systems, go forward and backward because of change in government? Because when you come back, you will certainly reintroduce your infrastructure plans. Am I right?
Well, of course, we'll introduce policies that we think are the best for the country. But what you're getting to is a bit of a problem that we do have in infrastructure, which is that ideally what you want to get to is a long-term vision and plan that you're consistent with in terms of delivering. That means you make progress for the communities that you serve, and it means that the infrastructure sector can make sure that it's got the resources, the people, the skills to deliver according to that plan. Whereas if big projects start and stop and start and stop, it makes that much
That's
more
the
difficult.
problem, Michael. You see, if you take Sydney and Melbourne, for instance, even those cities undergo changes in government between Labor and non-Labor governments in Australia. But they have, each city, Sydney and Melbourne, has committed to spending something like 250 billion Australian dollars each on just rail transport over the next 50 years. So which means the Australians can be assured of good transport system no matter which government comes in. Is it not possible for us to have a similar arrangement here?
That is what I would like us to achieve. I would say two things about this. One thing that Labor did was to establish the Infrastructure Commission.
Yep.
And the purpose of the Infrastructure Commission is to have a clear 30-year plan for how we develop infrastructure, whether it's transport or other key public infrastructure. So that was one of the things that we did to try and make a change there. We did also try to work with the National Party. So when I was a Transport Minister, for example, I wrote to Christopher Luxon when he was an Associate Transport Spokesperson and said, will you work with us on an agreed plan for mass rapid transit in Auckland? He didn't even bother to reply. We wrote to them and said, will you work with us on congestion charging in our bigger cities and developing a sustainable plan that we both agree to? They pulled out of that. So Labor is up for having a sensible political consensus in these areas, but the other side's got to play. The difference with Australia is that in Australia you have the Conservative Party, which is not allergic to public transport. The Conservative Party's there, the Liberal Party is still willing to invest in rail and public transport. The problem we have in New Zealand is that the National Party has some sort of weird ideological aversion to investing in rail and public transport. And so it's difficult to get a consensus under those conditions. We'll keep trying, but you've got to have the other party at the table. Basic stuff like the Inter-Islander ferry. We are now seriously at risk of not having a connection between our North and South Islands because of National's handling of this issue. You need consensus on those sorts of things.
I hope to get Simeon Brown sometime for a discussion with you, which we will do hopefully soon. Coming to immigration, you have been accused of having introduced the accreditation scheme, which was faulty and which became a fraudulent scheme, and therefore it had to be tweaked. What is your response to that, Michael?
Well, the Accredited Employer Work Visa Scheme is, of course, still the scheme that is in place. And the government hasn't actually said that they will replace it. Whatever visa system you have, you're constantly reviewing and tweaking. And I think that some of the changes that the government has made to AEWV are positive and some are not. You've got to actually look at the evidence. If there's a suggestion that migrant exploitation started when that scheme came in place, then that is complete rubbish. Unfortunately in New Zealand and every other country, we have always had this issue of migrant exploitation in our system. One of the reasons it's become more evident is because it was the Labor government that put in place a migrant exploitation visa. So that if workers were being exploited, they were able to raise that issue and receive a visa to stay in New Zealand. The problem we had before that point is that if a worker raised an issue of migrant exploitation, they generally then got deported because there was no longer any valid visa. So you have now had more visibility of migrant exploitation issues because Labor has been supporting those workers. So I don't accept that it's suddenly
Michael, I think people
there.
generally accept that the way you operated the visa system was a good relief for most businesses as well. And then by opening up the country, you brought in at a crucial time the requisite labor. But the problem was, or rather continues perhaps, is one, when Andrew Little became the Minister for Immigration, the system collapsed, and two, Immigration New Zealand was deliberately delaying visas for some people. This is the charge we hear from the community. I don't know whether it's true or not. But the problem of immigration persists. People are not getting visas properly. Visitor visas are being delayed enormously. So the purpose for applying for a visitor visa is lost. People want to come for a certain occasion. It takes months for them to do it. But do you think you have a way, considering that you might be able to return and then perhaps take over this portfolio of immigration? How exactly do you think you can fix it for a considerable period of time?
Well, this is what you have spoken about as one of the tensions that we face in immigration policy, whichever government is. On one hand, you get criticism, and there has been criticism that maybe the system was not tight enough, that there should have been greater scrutiny of applications for people coming to work to make sure you reduce the exploitation. If you do that, that will take more time and slow down the process. On the other hand, when the immigration system does take some time to run checks and balances and check that what people are saying is true on their visas and that kind of thing, there will be criticism for that as well. And so there is always a tension, and you have to find an appropriate balance within the system. Now, what I'd say with that visitor visa issue is this: it was very slow post-COVID, and that was when the system was just starting again after it had been frozen for 2 years. Under Labor, we put a huge amount more resource into that system. More people sitting there being able to process applications. And during our term in government, we actually made significant improvements in terms of the time that it took to process those visas. And the stats are all public, they're all published on the Immigration New Zealand website. We made real progress. We're now seeing that go backwards under this government. And one of the problems you have with this government is that they're making arbitrary cuts. They've said, well, MB, too many staff at MB. Well, who processes visas? It's MB staff through Immigration New Zealand. And so you're actually beginning to see a reduction in the people that can make these sort of systems go more quickly and more efficiently. So I predict this problem is going to get worse under this government, unfortunately. Labor's approach will be to make sure that we properly resource these areas and to continuously work to try and make sure that we get the balance right for people. And I'm confident that we can do much better than this government is in this area.
I don't think it will come as a surprise if I were to tell you that our communities, at least our readership, they believe that Michael Wood was the best immigration minister in a very long time, because you eased up and you listened to the businesses. That was one of the finest attributes that are given to you. Now, coming to the other important portfolio that you held, workplace relations and safety. My submission to you, Michael, is that today, whilst employers, there is a lot of cases of exploitation, you will agree with us and with everybody else that it's a small percentage of people who exploit migrant labor, or for that matter, any labor. And they will continue to do so, and the laws should be in place. But in the process, the acquisition that you face is that you have made it harder for honest employers to subsist, because they are not able to get any kind of work done with their employees, because they are able to, they say that ERA has become a very obnoxious body.
I'd say two things about that. Well, a few things. The first is that you're right, that the vast majority of employers are focused on running good businesses and treating their staff with respect. And that's a really positive thing. And you want to foster an environment where you support that to happen, and you don't have impediments to people getting about their lawful business. And of course, under Labor, one of the bits of evidence we have is what was happening with unemployment. Because if it really is true that Labor was making it really hard for businesses to operate and employ people, then unemployment would be high. In fact, the opposite was true. We had unemployment down to the lowest levels in nearly 40 years under a Labor government. So while there's always room for improvement and reflection, I think the argument that Labor was somehow stifling or making it difficult for businesses is just not sustained by those facts. Now, it's always important that in any system, particularly employment relations, you do have an ability for people to raise issues, grievances, work through problems that they have. And that's what the Employment Relations Authority is there for. And of course, it's been an institution that's been there since 2000, so through successive national and Labor governments, it's been in place. It's a judicially independent organisation from government. The officers of the ERA have a warrant from the Governor-General. There's no government interference in how they operate. So it's effectively a neutral organisation that people can go to,
But
have their arguments heard out. Now, my belief is that actually the best thing with any employment situation is that you resolve things at the lowest level possible. I would actually like to see us do much more in the employment system to support employers, employees and unions to do that. Before you have to get to the ERA or the court, it's best if you can resolve it at a lower level. And I think we could be putting much more focus and resource into that. Again, we have a problem there at the moment. The mediation services, which people go to before the ERA to try and resolve things more informally, is currently being cut back by the government. That makes it more likely that employers and employees will end up at the ERA and the courts.
But I still believe that there is a need for dialogue, a tripartite dialogue, if you like, so that the line of least resistance is employed. And there has to be a happy combination of employer-employee relations, employer-employee and government relations, and lastly, the ERA aspect. Right now, employers are petrified to even think of having a session with ERA because they say that it'll all end up against them. This is the impression that people have. So I suppose you need to have a policy change or a revisit to see how it can be made more equitable if it is not equitable. That's something that you need to see.
Well, of course, any institution like that, you do want to see it manage things in an equitable way. Periodically, the ERA does publish the outcomes from their hearings.
Yeah.
And I think it might be one where people are a bit surprised it doesn't always go in favour of the employee. It sometimes does, and it sometimes goes in favour of the employer. But often people going into these things, it is, if you're particularly a small employer, or a small employee actually,
Right.
going into a proceeding like that is quite intimidating. It does take a lot of time. If you're getting legal advice, it takes money. You don't know what the outcome might be. So I can appreciate that it's difficult and challenging. That's why, as I say, my focus, and I think there is room for reform here, would be what can we do to support getting good resolutions to employment problems much earlier than that point, before you have to go there and spend that money and that time and have those worries. That would be better for everyone, whether you're the employer or whether you're a worker.
Now that you're a member of the Labour Council, what do you call that, National Council?
The Labour Policy Council.
Well, Labour Policy. It's quite an important, perhaps the most important body of the National Party. Do you have time to reflect on the policies that you have been engaged when you were in government for 6 years? And have you started thinking about how to revitalize them for your 2026 campaign?
Yes, we're very involved in that process at the moment. I think one of the very helpful things that Chris Hipkins said after the election, he acknowledged that we lost badly at the last election. And so he said that we start from a blank slate. We always have our values as the Labour Party, and they will never ever change. The core belief that we have in the equality of all people, fair treatment for people, everyone having a voice in an inclusive society. But your policies need to adapt to the time and the issues that are pressing for people and relevant for people. So that's a process we're into now. Yes, there is some reflection on what worked and didn't work while we're in government, but primarily we're at the start of a process of looking forward and saying, what do we need to offer New Zealand in 2026 to be able to win back people's support? What are the issues that are really relevant for people? How do we apply our Labour values to those? So whether it's the economy, jobs, health, education, the environment, we're looking very closely at all of those areas and trying to have an offering that people will say, yeah, we can see something in that for our country and for my family.
How is the path of return working for Michael Wood?
Well, we're 6 months out from the previous election, about 2.5 years till the next election. And my focus is on two things within the Labour Party, really. One is we really want to win back the seat of Mount Roskill. And so we're focused on just doing the hard work that you have to do to win people's support and trust. We're already out there door knocking local houses in Mount Roskill.
Right.
We're running local community meetings. Our next one is this Saturday in Roskill South, so that we can listen to what people say is really important for our community. And we're going to campaign for 3 years to do everything we can to win back that seat.
Right.
And I'm confident that we can. And then the second area that I'm trying to help the party with is in that policy space. How do we make sure that here in Auckland and across New Zealand, that Labour is relevant and is seen as being relevant, that we're talking about the things that people matter,
Right.
that matter to people, and have got policies that do take the country forward. That's hugely interesting work for me. And what we're doing as a Labour Party is not just talking to ourselves, we're actually trying to face outwards, talking to people, whether it's people in business and different sectors, about where they think that we should be headed and what they think the problems and issues are that are relevant. So I'm really enjoying that at the moment.
You are a much adored and respected person in the communities, Michael, and I'm sure that people will welcome you back in 2026, except that it's going to be quite a challenge for Labour to win back the confidence of the people, and I'm sure you'll all be working towards it. With that note, thank you for giving us this opportunity to have a conversation with you, a conversation which will continue from time to time so that we can discuss issues of importance to you, to Labour Party, and to the people of New Zealand. Thank you very much, Michael.
Pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Indian Newslink podcast.